Currently, there's a piece of original comic art up for sale for $7.5 million. If it's purchased, it will be the most expensive piece of original comic art ever to be sold. In this video, I'm going to recreate that very expensive piece of comic art and draw it as though it were my own. What's up? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Thomas Patilli. The piece of comic art that we're talking about is the cover of New Mutants number 98. It was drawn by Rob Liefeld, the creator of Deadpool, and this cover actually also features one of his other creations, Cable. Apparently this is the first comic cover that Deadpool appears on. That's sort of the significance of it. There's this little indie movie out right now. It's called Deadpool Wolverine. You might have heard of it. Obviously that movie has sort of elevated the value of this particular comic. From what I've read, the owner of this piece of art has gotten multiple offers on this piece, and he has turned down all offers until this point. It is now on sale at Heritage Auction with an asking price of $7.5 million. That's a lot of money. I've been a comic nerd and comic fan ever since I was a kid, but I sort of missed the New Mutants craze. I think I was a little bit too young for it. I was still probably reading Archie and Spider-Man around that time. So as far as the characters, the New Mutant characters, I'm not really familiar with most of them. I obviously know who Cable is. He was also created by Rob Liefeld. I think I know Domino a little bit. And then there's this one character that looks like Jubilee, but it's not Jubilee apparently. Oh, and I know Cannonball, of course, from X-Men. So I'm somewhat familiar with some of these characters, but I don't have any real nostalgic connection with New Mutants. For me, years later, it was all about Generation X. That was my next generation of X-Men for me when I was growing up. It was also drawn by Chris Bachalo, who is one of my favorite comic book artists. I think that's a very overlooked, underrated comic series, especially the earlier issues. There's some really beautiful comic art in that series that was very much against the grain of traditional mainstream comic art of the time. But we're not talking about Generation X or Chris Bachalo in this video. I have made a video about Chris Bachalo. You might want to check it out. I'll put it here. But in this video, we're talking about Rob Liefeld and this New Mutants cover. It's an interesting topic, a piece of original art, comic art, being sold for $7.5 million. It sort of says a lot of things. I think without the success and craze of the Deadpool movies, I don't think this particular cover would gain that much attention and certainly not warrant that big a price tag. But it just sort of goes to show how pop culture and any kind of media craze can elevate or de-elevate certain value of things like art and comics and collectibles. The artist, Rob Liefeld, who drew this cover and created Deadpool as well as Cable, he's sort of a very, polarizing figure in the comic art world. Some people love him and some people really don't love him in terms of his art style. As a professional myself, I don't really get into that whole kind of discussion, only because I think I see it from a perspective that maybe is a little bit different than a comic fan. We can certainly talk about his style and his specific eccentricities when it comes to drawing certain body parts or lack thereof. But when I think of a guy like Rob Liefeld, I think of someone who created two very successful characters who went on to become sort of household names. I think of someone who was not only very successful in the world of traditional comic book publishing, but also someone who went off on their own, started their own publishing company, and was incredibly successful in that as well. Iconic characters, merchandise, toys, movies. Those aren't my particular aspirations, but I can respect an artist who has built up enough of name recognition and popularity through his work that he is able to seemingly live a very comfortable, relaxed life. When I was a kid, I was a big Jim Lee fan. Of the Image guys, Jim Lee was definitely my guy. I thought he drew the best out of that whole crew. But I was very intrigued with Rob Liefeld's work. That's sort of how I'll put it. He had a very distinct, unique style. And whatever you think of it, whether you love it or you hate it, to be able to stand out and be as unique as his style is, I think anyone who knows comic art can sort of spot a Rob Liefeld drawing from like a mile away. And that's something that's really, really hard to do. Certainly as an artist, I can really respect that. At the end of the day, it's very easy to sort of like critique an artist's work or somehow pretend that you can do better. And I totally get it. It's a very easy trap to fall into. Personally, myself, I obviously have my preferences and my tastes. But when it comes to voicing my opinions of another artist's work online, for instance, I like to keep my much harsher criticisms to myself, only because as an artist myself, I know how much work and how much time goes into creating these things. And I also know that judging art, being a fan of art, it's all very subjective. And what I might like, somebody else really might not like, and vice versa. But in an attempt to recreate this cover, I tried to put myself in the position of a young Rob Liefeld at the time. He was probably in his early 20s. For someone who was so relatively new to the business, he was already creating new characters. Marvel had a lot of trust in him, and he had a lot of responsibility there as a creative. And the turnaround time on a cover like this might have been really, really tight. I know myself as a comic artist working in comics, you don't have the luxury of time. I'll just put it that way. Deadlines are usually really, really tight. And oftentimes you may have a particular vision for a piece, but the sort of like intangible ingredient that goes along with your style, I've said this often, is the amount of time that you actually have to execute something. So if Rob Liefeld, or any comic artist for that matter, had more time, say like a month or 2 months or 6 months to work on a cover, it might look completely different, but this cover might have very well been turned around like overnight. I would guess that he certainly didn't spend any more than like a day working on this cover. I don't know if this was the case with Rob Liefeld, but I do know that it was the case with Mark Silvestri. Oftentimes, artists of that time were working on more than one monthly book a month, which is a lot of pages a month. So being fast was really a skill worth having back then, and something that was very much sought out and valued. I know, and I'm sure you do as well, whenever you look at older work, you sort of cringe. In retrospect, it's very easy to sort of see all the mistakes and point out what you could have done better. But when you're in the moment, you get very caught up in the piece that you're working on. And if it has to get done in a very short amount of time, you get even more zeroed in. These videos actually take a while to make, not only recording, but the editing and putting the thumbnail and the title and everything together. It usually takes me about a week just to make one of these relatively short videos. So knowing that I wanted to get this video done by the end of the week, I knew that I couldn't really spend that much time working on this piece. So I really turned it around in like a 24-hour period of time, which is sort of the pace I'm assuming Rob Liefeld was working under. It might have been a lot faster than that as well. If you happen to know Rob Liefeld, or if Rob Liefeld is watching this video, comment down below and let me know how long he actually had to work on this piece of art. And as an artist looking at it, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 characters on this cover. And he's featuring a brand new character front and center. Compositionally, that's a tall order. You have to factor in that there's going to be the logo on the cover, and there's going to be little extra text boxes and design elements around there as well. So you're not really working with a lot of real estate at all. Hence the big headshots on one side, and really only one clear full body shot, which is Deadpool. Totally makes sense. That's the featured prominent character of the cover. The way I sort of went about this recreation is that I didn't want this to be like a facsimile. I didn't want to do a study, for instance, like I did in a couple of other videos ago. I wasn't going to do that with this cover. I wanted to kind of make it my own to some extent. But I also wanted it to be very recognizable as this New Mutants 98 cover. So I didn't really stray too far, certainly not in terms of the composition or the poses or anything like that. But in order to sort of make it a little bit more my own, I did change the proportions and the faces, and I drew them a little bit more in the way that I might draw some of these characters. So I started that process, I guess you could call that the first draft of the pencils. I started that digitally, where I just sort of drew over Rob's cover and created a new layer on top. This helped me make it my own a little bit more and connect with the piece more on an artistic level. Once I got done with that stage, I printed it out full size, which is 11 by 17. Then what I did was I took that digital sketch, I taped it underneath a fresh sheet of vellum finish Bristol board paper, and I just lightboxed it. And I penciled on top of that and kind of like refined what I did digitally underneath. I don't really think too much about style as much anymore as an artist. I really think more about just perfecting my drawing skills as well as my communication and storytelling skills. But doing this kind of was like an exercise in understanding my style a little bit better, because although I was interpreting this as me, as Thomas Batilli, not Rob Liefeld, and I changed a fair amount of things as far as proportions go and faces go, it highlighted to me just how influenced I really am by that like Image Comics style. Growing up, I was a huge Image Comics fan. Obviously, like I said, Jim Lee was my guy. But there's certain tropes and defining characteristics of the Image Comics style that still do show up in my own work today. So as much as Rob Liefeld's style is a real extreme version of that Image style, pardon the pun, somehow, either directly or indirectly, I was and still continue to be inspired and influenced by that look. As far as brushes and pens go, I do know that at a certain point in Rob Liefeld's process, he moved from the traditional crow quill inking to pens, microns, and other technical pens. But I think this was still the era where he was using crow quill pens to ink. So I'm assuming he was using mainly crow quill pens and probably some brush. For my version, I mainly used a brush pen to ink the Deadpool character because he's front and center, and I wanted him to be a little bit more bold and kind of stand out from all the background elements. And then for the background characters, I used a variety of different technical pens. I love these Marvy Lay pens. I talk about these all the time. They're really great. I still have some leftover Staedtler pens. These are great too. They're just a little bit more expensive. And then a variety of other pens and brush pens. In the description down below, I'll leave a link to where you could get all the supplies that I used in this video if you're interested. But as far as speed goes, I feel like the pens really do speed things up quite a bit. It really all does come down to meeting that deadline, making things look clear, and hopefully having the ink on your paper age well so it doesn't like fade. And it seems like this particular piece that's currently up for $7.5 million has actually aged pretty well. It doesn't look like it's faded at all. So I'm sure he was using some good quality inks, which definitely paid off. I have to say, this was really, really fun to work on. It's cool to just kind of like look at it right now. I know it's not the original $7.5 million Rob Liefeld piece, but it's cool to have created something that very much looks like comic book covers of my time growing up. It has a certain kind of like nostalgic feel to it. And to see that kind of like come out of my own hand is really cool. But studying a cover like this really helps me understand the value of balancing black and white on a page in a way that's clear, easy to read, eye-catching, and hopefully sells a reader on a specific idea. You can certainly have your critiques about this particular piece of art, but in my opinion, I think it checks all of those boxes. There's something about creating original art, something about putting ink down on Bristol board paper with a variety of different pens and brushes that at the end of it, I don't know, to me it just feels like I've done something. It feels like I really accomplished something. I could look at it upside down. I could step away. I could look at it from the other side of the room. I could imagine what it might look like colored and smaller in comic book form. But that's one of the things about working traditionally that you don't get out of working digitally. I certainly do work digitally from time to time. Most, if not all, of the comic work that I've done to this point, as far as the published work goes, has all been done digitally. I definitely don't knock digital art and certainly understand its utility for sure. But there's just something about the tactileness and the feel of original art that I think is really special. And it's one of the reasons why the original piece of this is going for $7.5 million. We don't know, at least at the time of this recording, if it is actually going to sell for that particular amount, but it would be very, very hard to get a piece of digital art to sell for anywhere near that. So as comic book artists, whether you're aspiring or professional, it's one of those things to think about. As far as like financial stuff goes, it's better to get paid twice than once. So if you're working for a publisher, you get a page rate or you get just an overall amount of money for the book that you're working on. However it's structured, you get paid once. Depending on how the book sells, you might get some residual payments. But if you have the option and you have the time, I think it behooves all of us to be able to create ways in which we can make money twice. And the way to do that is to sell the original art from that book. And depending on the popularity of that book, the fan base, you're likely to sell each page for more than you actually got paid to do it. And you never know, 30 years down the line, one of those pages or covers might actually be worth millions of dollars. Who knows? Speaking of selling original comic art, I am actually going to put this one up for sale. I will make it very clear that I'm not trying to fool anyone. This is not a counterfeit. This is certainly just my humble interpretation of it. But I will be putting it up if anyone is interested. All the details for that will be in the description below if you're interested in picking this one up. So like I said, this was a really fun project to work on. It goes really very much in line with a lot of these copies and master studies that I've been doing lately. And like I said, although this is not like a one-for-one copy or a study, it's more of an interpretation of a classic cover. Every time I do one of these types of things, I come away learning quite a bit. Learning a lot about that particular artist's approach, but also learning more about my sensibilities, my own influences, and having a really cool looking original sitting on my desk right now just makes me want to make more original art. So if nothing else, it just inspires me to want to keep making really badass, cool looking art. I have a question for you though. If you had an endless amount of money, what piece of original comic art would you want to own in your private collection? It doesn't have to be like Action Comics #1 or the first appearance of Spider-Man or anything like that. I mean, if it is, that's cool. But it could be something very specific from your childhood or a comic that really inspired you to want to draw comics if you do draw comics. It could be a piece of art that features your favorite character. It could be anything that's just drawn by your favorite artist. Whatever it is, I'd love to know. Leave it down below. I have a bunch myself and I'll probably leave them in the comments below, but I'm curious to know yours as well. So that's it for this video. It was fun. I hope you got something out of it. If you did, please do like it and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more videos like this. All right, that's it for me. Hope you had fun. I know I did. As always, thanks so much for watching and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.